You know the story. 300 Spartans, a narrow mountain pass, an empire stopped cold by men who chose death over surrender. You've seen the films, you've heard the speeches. Thermopylae, the legend, is burned into our memory like a brand, but nobody ever told you about the other battle, the one happening 40 miles away, on the water, at the exact same time. While Leonidas held that narrow pass in blood and bronze, 271 Greek warships were stretched across a choke point in the Aegean Sea, staring down a Persian armada that, by ancient accounts, numbered over 1,000 vessels. Think about that. 1,000 ships, stretched from horizon to horizon, a wall of wood and oars and fire, the most terrifying naval force the ancient world had ever assembled. The Greeks had nowhere to run. Behind them lay their homeland, their cities, their families. Before them, the full fury of Xerxes, the great king of Persia, a man who had already whipped the Hellespont for daring to defy him. Most men would have fled. These men chose to fight. For 3 consecutive days, in waters churned by supernatural storms that ancient Greeks believed were answers to their prayers, this outnumbered, outgunned fleet of city-states, fractured by politics, united only by desperation, clawed, rammed, and bled their way through the mightiest navy on earth. This is not the story history forgot. This is the story history was never properly told. This is the Battle of Artemisium, and it is every bit as savage, every bit as defiant, and every bit as important as the legend it fought beside. Before we sail into history, if you're new here, welcome to Wars in History. We go where the textbooks don't. Hit subscribe and ring that bell because this is the kind of story that deserves to be told right. And if you're already part of this crew, you already know. Let's go. In the summer of 480 BC, the ancient world held its breath. The Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus River, was moving west. At its head rode Xerxes I, the king of kings, who claimed to rule by the favour of Ahura Mazda, a man who believed the gods themselves had ordained him to bring the Greek city-states to their knees. This was not a diplomatic mission. This was not a border dispute. This was the full, organised weight of civilization's most powerful empire, aimed like a spear at the throat of Greece, and every Greek alive in 480 BC understood exactly what was coming for them. What made this invasion unlike anything that had come before was its sheer, staggering scale. Xerxes had spent the better part of 4 years preparing. He had dug a canal through the peninsula of Mount Athos, wide enough for 2 warships to row side by side, so his fleet would never again have to round that treacherous headland where a previous Persian fleet had been destroyed in a storm in 492 BC. He had bridged the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, with 2 massive pontoon bridges made of hundreds of boats lashed side by side, with flaxen and papyrus ropes, stretching nearly a mile across open water. Ancient sources record that his army took 7 days and 7 nights to cross without pause, a river of men, horses, chariots and supplies flowing from one continent to another in an unbroken stream. The Greek city-states had been feuding with each other for generations. Corinth and Athens distrusted one another deeply. Sparta and Athens held opposing visions for what Greece should be. The island states guarded their independence jealously. Yet in 481 BC, at the Congress at the Isthmus of Corinth, 31 city-states had set aside enough of their rivalry to form the Hellenic League, a defensive alliance forged not from goodwill, but from the cold arithmetic of shared destruction. The members swore oaths by Zeus, Poseidon, and the gods of Greece to honour their mutual defence. They agreed that any Greek state that sided with Persia would have 1/10 of its wealth dedicated to Apollo at Delphi as punishment. It was a fragile coalition, held together not by genuine unity, but by the understanding that if Persia crossed into Greece unopposed, there would be no city-states left to argue over anything. The Persian fleet that sailed into the Aegean in the summer of 480 BC was, by any measure of the ancient world, a sight beyond human comprehension. Herodotus, who recorded the invasion in meticulous detail, counted 1,207 warships when the fleet crossed the Hellespont, crewed by sailors drawn from every corner of the empire. Phoenicia and Palestine contributed 300 of the finest triremes in the ancient world, manned by the most experienced seafarers alive. Egypt sent 200 heavy ships. Cyprus contributed 150, Cilicia, Pamphylia, Lycia, and the Dorian cities of Asia Minor added hundreds more. Ionian Greeks, many of them bitter subjects of Persian rule who privately harboured sympathies for their mainland cousins, rode 100 ships under Persian command. When you add the fleets of the Hellespont, the Aegean Islands, Aeolia and Caria, the number climbs past 1,000 vessels. Modern historians debate whether the figure Herodotus provides is inflated, with estimates ranging from 500 to 800 combat ships as more plausible. But even the most conservative scholarly estimate places the Persian navy at a size that the entire assembled Greek alliance could not match on equal terms. Alongside the warships sailed thousands of transport and supply ships carrying soldiers, horses, grain, and the equipment of siege warfare. The fleet did not merely sail the Aegean, it appeared to consume it. For the Greeks, the psychological impact of watching this armada approach was devastating in a way that maps and numbers cannot fully convey. These were not soldiers looking at a larger army on a distant plain. These were sailors and commanders anchored at Artemisium, the promontory at the northern tip of the island of Euboea, watching what appeared to be the entire horizon transform into wood and canvas. The Greek fleet at Artemisium numbered 271 triremes in total. Athens contributed the largest contingent, 127 ships crewed by Athenians and their Plataean allies, the product of Themistocles' decade-long campaign to transform Athens into a naval power. Corinth sent 40 triremes, Megara contributed 20, Aegina sent 18, Sicyon provided 12, Sparta, whose strength was always on land, sent just 10. The remainder came from Epidaurus, Eretria, Troezen, Styra, Chios, and other smaller states. It was a respectable force by the standards of any previous Greek conflict. Measured against the approaching Persian armada, it was, as one historian has described it, like watching a village constable step into the road to stop a marching army. According to Herodotus, when the Greek lookouts on Mount Pelion first caught sight of the Persian fleet moving down the Thessalian coastline, many commanders immediately argued for retreat. Several contingents were on the verge of turning south before the battle had even begun. Then something happened that no admiral in any fleet could have planned for, and no Greek dared to believe when it first began. The Persian fleet, after rounding the Thessalian coastline, anchored along the coast of Magnesia near Cape Sepias, a stretch of shoreline that every local fisherman knew was dangerously exposed to the northeast winds that rake down from the mountains of Thessaly in summer. The fleet was so enormous that there was simply not enough sheltered anchorage for all of it. The lead ships pulled onto the beach, 8 rows deep where space allowed, while hundreds more were forced to anchor in open water, bobbing hull to hull in the swells. The Persians had no choice. They had to stop, rest and organise before pressing south. What they could not control was the sky. On the morning of their second day at anchor, the Hellespontine wind, a fierce, relentless gale out of the north, descended upon the coast without warning, and it did not stop for 3 full days. Herodotus describes what followed in terms that read less like a weather report and more like divine intervention, and in the ancient Greek mind, that was precisely what it was. The storm drove anchored ships from their moorings and hurled them against the rocky Magnesian coastline with unstoppable force. Ships lashed alongside each other were ground together until their hulls disintegrated. Vessels that managed to cut their anchor cables were driven south into the open Aegean, where many were wrecked along the coastline of Euboea at a stretch the Greeks called the Hollows. The sea between Magnesia and Euboea became a churning mass of broken timber, shredded canvas, bronze, fittings, supply crates, drowned horses, and bodies. For 3 days the Magi, the Persian priestly caste, reportedly performed sacrifices and ritual chanting to calm the tempest, offering prayers to Thetis, the sea goddess, at the urging of local Ionian crews who knew the regional myths. Whether their prayers were answered, or the storm simply exhausted itself, after 3 days the winds died. When the Persians finally counted what remained, the losses were staggering. Herodotus puts the minimum number of warships lost at 400. Diodorus Siculus, writing later, records 300. A Magnesian landowner named Amenocles, whose property ran along the shore near Cape Sepias, reportedly became one of the wealthiest men in the region overnight, collecting the gold and silver cups, sealed treasure chests, embroidered cloaks, and jewelled fittings that washed ashore in the storm's wake. The sea, in 3 days of fury, had done to the Persian fleet what the combined Greek navy could not have accomplished in 3 months of open battle. For the Greeks at Artemisium, the news arrived like cold water thrown on a dying fire, sudden, sharp, and restorative. They had been on the edge of full retreat before the storm struck. The commanders of multiple contingents had argued loudly for withdrawing south, closer to the narrower waters near the isthmus, where they felt geography might compensate for what they lacked in numbers. The destruction at Cape Sepias did not eliminate the Persian naval advantage. Even with 400 ships lost, Xerxes still commanded a fleet that outnumbered the Greeks by more than 3-1, but it transformed the conversation from impossible to merely desperate. The arithmetic of survival had shifted just enough for a man of sufficient nerve to argue that a battle was worth fighting, and at Artemisium, in the cramped, sea-sprayed council of Greek commanders, there was exactly one such man. His name was Themistocles, and everything that happened next in this war, at Artemisium, at Salamis, and in the years that followed, began with him. Themistocles was not what the Greeks of his generation expected a great man to look like. He was born around 524 BC, the son of a man named Neocles of the minor Lycomid family, and his mother was almost certainly not a full Athenian citizen. Ancient sources describe her as possibly Carian, Thracian, or from Halicarnassus, depending on which account you read. In a society where the bloodline of both parents determined your standing, Themistocles began life on the margins of Athenian respectability. He owed his very citizenship to the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes, which in 508 BC had extended political rights to all free men of Athens regardless of ancestry. Plutarch records that as a young man he was impulsive, restless, and consumed by ambition to a degree that made older aristocrats visibly uncomfortable. He was not a gifted student of poetry or philosophy in the traditional Athenian mode. He spent his free time, Plutarch tells us, writing and rehearsing speeches, practicing persuasion with the same intensity that Spartan boys practiced combat. He was, from his earliest youth, a man who understood that in a democracy words were power, and he intended to have both. His political rise was steady and deliberate. In 493 BC, he was elected Archon, the chief judicial and civilian executive officer of Athens, and he immediately used the position not for personal enrichment or social advancement, but to pursue a strategic obsession that would define his entire career. He began developing the port of Piraeus, transforming its naturally fortified rocky bays from a minor landing point into what would eventually become the greatest naval base in the Greek world. He saw, earlier than almost any of his contemporaries, that Athens' future lay not in its hoplite infantry, impressive though that force was, but on the water. The city sat at the centre of a sea-trading network that stretched across the Aegean, and whoever controlled those sea lanes controlled Athens' lifeblood. Themistocles understood this not as an abstract strategic theory, but as a concrete and urgent fact. He pushed for it year after year in assembly speeches and private council meetings against the opposition of wealthy landowners who had no interest in funding a navy and whose political instinct was to remain a land power. For most of the 490s they won the argument. Then, in 483 BC, the earth gave Themistocles his opening. A new, extraordinarily rich silver lode was struck at the state-owned mines of Laurion, near Sunium on the southern tip of Attica. The windfall was enormous, enough that the Athenian assembly began debating what to do with the surplus. The instinct of many citizens was to distribute it directly, a cash dividend to every Athenian male. Themistocles had a different idea, and he prosecuted it with every tool of persuasion available to him. He argued that the ongoing conflict with the neighbouring island state of Aegina, a genuine and painful naval rivalry that had already cost Athens ships and lives, required an urgent expansion of the fleet. He proposed using the entire Laurion surplus to build 200 new triremes. Critically, he framed the argument around Aegina, not Persia, because he knew that the Persian threat still felt abstract and distant to many Athenians. While Aegina was a real and present humiliation, the assembly voted yes. Almost overnight, Athens went from roughly 70 operational triremes to a force of 200. It was the largest single naval expansion any Greek city-state had ever undertaken, and it would prove to be the single most consequential political decision of the entire Persian War. By the time the Persian storm had passed at Cape Sepias and the Greek commanders gathered in council at Artemisium, the situation Themistocles faced was not simply military. It was a political crisis of the first order. Several of the allied commanders were ready to abandon the position entirely and sail south. The Euboeans, whose island lay directly at stake in any battle fought in these waters, sent a representative to the Greek council with an urgent appeal. Do not leave us. Do not abandon Euboea to the Persians without a fight. They backed this plea with treasure, 30 silver talents paid directly to Themistocles to secure the fleet's continued presence. Themistocles received this money and then, in a move of breathtaking political audacity that Herodotus reports without obvious condemnation, he used it as bribes. He gave 5 talents to Eurybiades, the Spartan admiral who held overall command of the Greek fleet by virtue of Sparta's political dominance over the alliance. Because the allied Greeks had agreed to serve under Spartan command only, and without Eurybiades' agreement to stay and fight, the coalition would dissolve. He gave 3 talents to Adimantus of Corinth, whose contingent of 40 ships was among the most vocal in demanding retreat. He kept the rest, likely for further political management. Neither Eurybiades nor Adimantus was told where the silver had come from. Both, after receiving it, agreed to remain at Artemisium. The choice of Artemisium as the fighting ground was itself Themistocles' most important strategic decision, and it was grounded in a principle he would use again and again throughout the war. When outnumbered, choose the ground that makes numbers irrelevant. The strait between the coast of Thessaly and the northern tip of Euboea was narrow enough that the Persian fleet, regardless of its true size, could not deploy its full strength in a single engagement. The Persians could not use their numerical advantage to encircle the Greeks from multiple directions simultaneously. In open water, 1,000 Persian ships could engulf 271 Greek triremes on all sides and destroy them utterly. In the narrows of Artemisium, the battle would be decided not by how many ships you had, but by how well your front line could fight. And this was where Themistocles understood the Greeks had a genuine edge. The Athenian and Corinthian crews were well trained and motivated. Their triremes, sleek, lightweight, approximately 37 metres long and just 6 metres wide, powered by 170 oarsmen arranged across 3 banks, were built for speed and precision ramming. The Persian fleet, for all its size, was a coalition of conscripted subject navies rowing under the authority of empire rather than the conviction of free men defending their own homeland. In a grinding claustrophobic fight in narrow water, conviction and training would matter more than numbers. Themistocles bet everything on that calculation. There was one more dimension to the political situation at Artemisium that deserves to be fully understood, because it shaped every decision the Greek commanders made throughout those 3 days of fighting. The naval battle was not being fought in isolation. 40 miles to the northwest, at the mountain pass of Thermopylae, King Leonidas of Sparta was holding the narrow coastal road into central Greece with a force of roughly 7,000 men, including his famous 300 Spartiate warriors, against the full weight of Xerxes' land army. The 2 positions were strategically inseparable. If the Greek fleet abandoned Artemisium, the Persian navy could sail around Euboea, land troops behind Thermopylae, and render Leonidas' entire defence pointless in a matter of hours. If Thermopylae fell, the Persian army would pour into central Greece, and the Greek fleet at Artemisium would find itself fighting with no friendly coastline to its rear, no port for resupply, and no home left worth defending. Themistocles understood this bond completely. Holding the water and holding the pass were not 2 separate battles. They were 2 halves of a single, desperate strategy to buy time. Time for the alliance to hold together, time for the Persians to bleed, and time, perhaps, for a third element to intervene. Because beyond all the politics and the bribes and the strategic geometry, Themistocles was also watching the sky, and the Aegean sky in summer was not finished speaking. Before we get into the battle itself, a quick word about something that keeps this channel going. You come here for the real, unfiltered story, and that same instinct drives me to use NordVPN every day. It encrypts your connection, hides your IP, and lets you access content freely without being tracked or throttled. I use it while researching, travelling and working, and if you want to support wars in history while protecting your own privacy, the link is in the description. Now, back to the battle, because what happens next on these waters is something you will not believe actually happened. To understand what the sailors and marines of the Greek fleet were about to experience, you first need to understand the weapon they were fighting in and fighting with. The Greek trireme was one of the most sophisticated and physically demanding fighting machines the ancient world ever produced. It was approximately 37 metres long and just under 6 metres wide at its widest point, a slender, knife-like hull built for a single purpose: speed, precision, and the delivery of its primary weapon, the bronze ram mounted at its bow. That ram, called an embolon, was not a blunt instrument. It was a precisely engineered bronze casting fitted around the forward extension of the ship's keel, shaped to pierce an enemy hull below the waterline with enough force to flood the vessel, but designed so that the attacking ship could back away using its oars before being dragged down with its victim. A bronze ram recovered from the waters near Artemisium and now displayed at the Archaeological Museum of Piraeus, measuring 74 centimetres in length and weighing over 80 kilograms in its original form, decorated with the trident of Poseidon, gives us a tangible physical connection to the ships that fought in these waters in 480 BC. The trireme was powered by 170 oarsmen, arranged across 3 banks, stacked vertically along each side of the hull. The topmost rowers, called thranites, sat with their oars extending outward and slightly upward through an outrigger frame beyond the hull's edge. Below them sat the zeugitai, and below them the thalamitai, working their oars through small oarports cut just above the waterline. The thranites, 62 of them per ship, were the most experienced and the best paid, because their position required the greatest physical coordination, and because they were the only rowers who could actually see outside the ship during combat. Everyone below them rowed in near total darkness, able to see nothing beyond the back of the man in front of them, and the rhythmic flash of their own oar blade entering and leaving the water. They rowed by sound, by the cadence of a pipe player, the orlos, whose notes set the stroke rate, and by feel, pushing and pulling with everything they had, trusting the trierarch above and the steersman at the twin rudder oars to put the ram where it needed to go. The physical demands were extraordinary. A trireme at combat speed consumed its crew at a rate that modern, experimental reconstructions have confirmed is close to the limit of human endurance. The crews of the Olympias, the modern reconstruction of an ancient trireme built by the Greek Navy in 1987 and crewed by 170 volunteer oarsmen, found that maintaining battle speed for more than 45 minutes pushed experienced rowers to the edge of physical collapse. Each trireme also carried between 10 and 14 marines known as epibatai. These were hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen carrying a bronze-faced wooden shield roughly a metre in diameter, a thrusting spear typically 2 metres in length, and a short iron sword as a backup weapon. They wore bronze breastplates or layered linen armour, bronze greaves on their lower legs, and bronze or leather helmets. On land, the hoplite was the backbone of Greek military power, fighting in the tight, interlocking formation known as the phalanx. On a trireme, he was something different, a specialist in controlled violence on a moving, heaving wooden deck, required to be simultaneously a fighter, a boarding threat, and a psychological weapon. The sight of a line of armoured hoplites standing on the bow of an approaching trireme was deliberately terrifying. Each ship also carried 4 archers, whose role was to thin enemy decks before boarding or ramming. The Persian triremes, by contrast, carried 14 marines per ship, and 30 additional fighters drawn from the Median infantry, archers, spearmen, and swordsmen, giving the Persian vessels a significant advantage in any boarding action, but adding considerable weight that reduced their manoeuvrability in tight waters. What Herodotus records, and what the scholarly analysis of the Hellenic Naval Academy's academic journal confirms from the ancient sources, is that the Greek ships at Artemisium were actually heavier than the Persian ones. This seems counterintuitive given the Greek numerical disadvantage, but it reflects a deliberate tactical philosophy. Heavier ships, whether because of broader construction, additional armed men or sturdier build, could better survive the brutal shock of close combat than lighter vessels. The Greeks were not, in 480 BC, the manoeuvring virtuosos they would eventually become during the Peloponnesian War 50 years later. The complex fleet manoeuvres, the diekplus, in which a squadron drives through the enemy line in single file to ram exposed flanks, or the periplus, in which a fleet swings around the enemy's wing, were beyond the skill level of most allied Greek crews at this stage of their naval development. What the Greeks at Artemisium knew how to do was fight the way they fought on land, straight ahead, hull to hull, bow into bow, with the stronger ship and the better armoured marines winning the close-quarter struggle. Themistocles had chosen the narrows of Artemisium precisely because this kind of fighting, grinding, brutal, close and attritional, was where the Greek fleet had its best chance against a numerically superior opponent. Now, before the first Persian galley ever rowed into striking range, something happened that changed the entire tactical calculus of the engagement. the Persian command, which had been watching the Greek fleet across the narrow strait of water separating the Thessalian coast from the north of Euboea, devised a plan to destroy the Greek position completely. They detached a squadron of 200 warships, according to Herodotus the finest ships in the fleet, crewed by the most experienced sailors, and sent them on a wide sweeping course around the eastern coast of Euboea. The plan was elegant and potentially war-ending. While the main Persian fleet engaged the Greeks frontally in the straits of Artemisium, this flanking squadron would complete its circuit of Euboea, emerge from the south through the Euripus Strait, and cut off any Greek retreat. The Greek fleet, engaged on one side and blocked on the other, would have nowhere to go. They would be encircled, destroyed, and the sea road into the heart of Greece would lie open. It was exactly the kind of large-scale envelopment that Persian imperial strategy excelled at, the same thinking that had sent infantry around Leonidas at Thermopylae. On paper, it was decisive. Had it succeeded, the story of Greece might have ended in the Straits of Artemisium rather than the triumph of Salamis. But the Aegean had not finished its work. On the night after the Persian flanking squadron set out, a second violent storm descended on the eastern coast of Euboea. The 200 ships, threading their way down an unfamiliar and treacherous coastline in darkness, were caught completely exposed. The stretch of Euboean coastline known to the Greeks as the Hollows, a long, rocky, cliff-broken shore with very little shelter, became a killing ground. Ships were driven onto the rocks, hulls shattered against the jagged Euboean coast. Men who survived the initial impact drowned in surf too violent and too dark for rescue. Herodotus records the destruction as total. Of the 200 ships dispatched on this flanking mission, none returned. Not a single vessel survived to complete the encirclement. The Greeks, who had been guarding the southern passage through the Euripus Channel with a squadron of 53 ships from Athens, received the news of the flanking fleet's destruction and immediately sailed north to join the main fleet at Artemisium. In a single storm-wrecked night, the Persian plan for total encirclement had become a catastrophic loss, and the Greek fleet, rather than facing annihilation on two fronts, woke up to find itself reinforced and its strategic position significantly improved. The first day of actual combat at Artemisium began in the late afternoon. Herodotus records that the Persians, confident in their numbers even after the losses at Cape Sepias, decided to move against the Greek fleet. The Persian commanders arranged their ships in a broad crescent formation, a classic envelopment shape designed to curl around the edges of the Greek line and attack from multiple angles simultaneously. When the Greek lookouts reported this movement, Themistocles and the allied commanders made a critical decision. Rather than remaining at anchor and waiting to be overwhelmed, they ordered the fleet to row out to meet the Persians, but not in a conventional line. Instead, the Greek triremes formed the seklos, a tight circle, all bows pointing outward, sterns pointing inward, every ram facing the enemy. The formation looked, from above, like a hedgehog. It looked, from the Persian perspective, like an invitation to encircle and destroy. It was neither. It was a trap. The Kyklos was designed to solve the Greek fleet's most acute tactical problem, the threat of being outflanked. In open water, the Persian fleet's numerical superiority would allow it to wrap around the ends of any conventional Greek battle line and attack from the sides and rear, where triremes were most vulnerable. The Kyklos eliminated the flanks entirely. There were no ends to wrap around. There were no exposed sterns to ram. Every direction a Persian ship approached from, it faced a bronze ram pointing directly at it. The formation also served a second purpose. It was a coiled spring. At a signal, a trumpet blast or a shouted order from the flagship, the Kyklos could explode outward in every direction simultaneously, each Greek trireme accelerating from a standing position directly toward the nearest Persian vessel. The Persians, expecting to find a fleet trying to flee or forming a defensive line, instead found a formation that seemed to be offering itself for encirclement, and they moved to take what they assumed was an easy kill. When the Greek trumpet sounded and the Kyklos burst outward, the result was instantaneous chaos across the Persian front line. Each Greek captain had picked his target before the signal came. Each crew had been resting their oars in the inward-facing calm of the circle, conserving energy, while the Persians rowed hard to close the distance. Now the Greek triremes accelerated outward with the momentum of coiled muscle and desperation behind them. The Persian fleet spread in its encircling crescent, had individual ships approaching from different angles and at different speeds. The simultaneous outward explosion of the Kyklaos meant that many Persian ships suddenly found themselves facing a ram that was already moving toward them at full speed, with no time to turn, no room to accelerate away, and the press of their own fleet behind them preventing any quick retreat. The heavy Greek hulls, built to absorb the shock of frontal ramming, struck the lighter Persian vessels at the waterline. Oars snapped like kindling as the Greek bows drove through Persian rowing frames. Men were hurled from their benches by the impact. Where ramming was not immediately possible, where the ships came together side-on in the crush, the Greek hoplite marines surged across the gap onto Persian decks, driving into the lighter-armed Persian fighters with spear and shield. The fighting lasted until nightfall ended it, as darkness on the Aegean made further naval combat too dangerous even for desperate men. When the two fleets disengaged and the Greeks rowed back to their anchorage on the beaches south of the Artemisium promontory, they counted their ships and their dead. The results of the first day were, by any objective measure, a genuine tactical success for the Greeks. They had captured 30 Persian warships, an extraordinary result for an outnumbered fleet engaging the enemy for the first time. The cost was real. The Greeks had lost ships of their own, and every trireme that returned to the beach had oarsmen with bleeding hands and seizing muscles, marines with spear wounds and the shaking exhaustion of close combat, and hulls that needed urgent inspection and repair before the next day's fighting. But 30 Persian ships taken or sunk, their crews killed, drowned or captured, was a number that resonated through the entire Allied fleet that night. They had met the Persian navy face to face in the Aegean Sea, and they had not been swept aside. For men who had spent weeks staring at the horizon and calculating their own deaths, that was not a small thing. But then the night itself turned against them. Before the Greek commanders could even debate whether to attempt a withdrawal southward under cover of darkness, the Aegean delivered its third violent intervention of the campaign. A thunderstorm of unusual ferocity broke over the strait, lashing the anchorage with rain and violent wind. For the Greeks, this meant remaining on the beach through the storm, watching their damaged ships strain against their anchors and listening to the thunder roll across the water from the direction of the Persian anchorage at Aphytae. The Greeks, sheltered in relatively better anchorage behind the promontory, rode out the night with losses. For the Persian fleet at Aphytae, it was a far worse experience. The ships that had already suffered storm damage, that were riding at anchor in more exposed water, took additional punishment through the night. Herodotus describes the Persian anchorage at Aphytae as a scene of misery, men bailing water by hand, captains desperately checking moorings, and the wreckage of the campaign's earlier storm still washing against the hulls in the dark. The night storm did not destroy the Persian fleet, but it added one more layer of physical and psychological attrition to an armada that had already absorbed catastrophic losses before the battle had even properly begun. The second day of the battle was, by comparison with what came before and what came after, a day of deliberate, calculated violence on a smaller scale. The Persian fleet, having absorbed 2 storms and a sharp tactical defeat on the first day of fighting, did not sortie in full strength on the second morning. The Persian command needed time to reorganize, redistribute crews from damaged vessels, assess exactly how many ships remained combat effective, and prepare for a renewed effort. The Greeks used the morning to repair what could be repaired, rest the oarsmen who had pushed to the edge of their endurance the previous afternoon, and receive one of the most strategically significant pieces of news of the entire campaign. The 53 Athenian ships that had been stationed in the Euripus Channel to guard against Persian landing on Euboea's eastern coast now arrived at Artemisium, reinforcing the fleet and bringing with them the confirmed intelligence that the Persian flanking squadron of 200 ships had been destroyed in the night storm on the hollow coast. The Greeks sat with that information for a moment. 200 of the finest Persian ships gone. The encirclement plan ended before it began. The mood in the Greek anchorage shifted, not to confidence, because confidence was still a luxury none of them could afford, but to something more useful, a cold, calculating resolve that the fight was still winnable. The action on the second day came in the late afternoon. Rather than waiting for the Persians to make the next move, the Greek commanders sent the fleet out in a targeted strike against the Cilician contingent of the Persian navy. The Cilicians, sailors from the southern coast of what is now Turkey, were positioned at one end of the Persian anchorage, somewhat separated from the main Phoenician core of the fleet. This was the same hit-and-run tactical logic that had governed the first day. Attack a detached portion of a fleet too large to concentrate quickly, inflict damage, and withdraw before the full weight of Persian response could arrive. The Greek triremes drove into the Cilician squadron with organised violence. The Cilicians, possibly still disorganised from the previous night's storm damage, were caught at a disadvantage. The attack was sharp, fast, and deliberately brutal. Herodotus records that the Greeks struck the Cilician contingent hard, destroying or capturing a number of their vessels and inflicting serious losses on the squadron. As the sun dropped toward the horizon and the light began to fail, the Greek fleet turned and rowed back to their anchorage, leaving the wreckage of Cilician triremes drifting on the evening tide. It was another victory. It was also, on both sides, a recognition that the following day would be different. The Persians had been probed and bled on 2 consecutive afternoons. They would not stand for a third. The third day of the Battle of Artemisium was the day the full weight of Xerxes' naval empire finally came down on the Greek fleet without restraint or qualification. The Persian command had absorbed the losses, reorganised their formations, and reached the conclusion that careful manoeuvring and detached squadron actions had produced nothing but 2 days of defeat. On the morning of the third day, the entire combat-effective strength of the Persian fleet moved out of the anchorage at Aphytae in a single coordinated advance. Herodotus describes the Persian formation as a crescent, the classic attack formation of a fleet with numerical superiority, the same shape they had used on the first day, but now executed with the full mass of everything they had left. Modern scholarly estimates place the Persian fleet at this point at somewhere between 500 and 600 ships still operational, representing roughly half of the force that had crossed the Hellespont weeks earlier. With the rest already lost to the storms of Sepias, the flanking fleet wrecked on the hollow coast, and the ships taken or sunk in the 2 days of fighting. Against this force, the Greeks had roughly 271 triremes plus the 53 Athenian reinforcements, somewhere around 300 to 320 ships. The odds had narrowed dramatically from where they had begun. They had not equalised. The Greeks formed their line across the strait. There was no kite-close this time, no elaborate tactical trick to spring on an overconfident enemy. The Persians were not overconfident on the third day. They knew what they were doing, and they came to do it. The battle that developed was not one of clever manoeuvre or the sudden surprise of an unexpected formation. It was a grinding, shattering, hour-by-hour struggle of endurance and will in which the 2 fleets drove into each other repeatedly across the narrowing channel and fought until ships were too damaged to continue. The Persians used their numbers to maintain pressure across the entire Greek line simultaneously, ensuring that no section of the Greek formation could rest or rotate while another fought. Wherever a Greek trireme was damaged or fell back from the line with dead oarsmen or a fouled ram, a Persian ship was there to press the advantage. The Greeks responded by fighting with a ferocity born of understanding exactly what lay behind them: their homes, their families, the cities that would cease to exist if this line broke. The physical experience of naval combat on this scale, for the men inside those ships, defies easy description, but demands to be confronted honestly. For the 170 oarsmen on each Greek trireme, the battle meant hours of rowing at or near maximum effort in a dark enclosed wooden hull, unable to see anything outside, with no way of knowing whether the ship was winning or losing, advancing or retreating. They felt the shocks of collision through the entire frame of the vessel, a ramming strike transmitted through the hull as a shattering jolt that could knock men from their benches or snap an oar blade into a rower's face. They heard the screaming of men on the decks above them and the sound of bronze on bronze when marines clashed across boarding planks. They rowed through water that was increasingly thick with floating wreckage, drifting bodies, and the debris of shattered ships. When a trireme was rammed and began to take water, the oarsmen in the lowest bank, the Thermopylae sitting closest to the waterline, sometimes drowned at their benches before they could climb clear, trapped in a flooding hull with no direct exit to the deck above. On the open deck above the oarsmen, the marine hoplites fought in conditions as brutal as anything the land soldiers at Thermopylae endured. When 2 ships came together in a ramming or boarding action, the marines crossed from one deck to the other, or tried to. The gap between 2 hulls in contact varied from inches to several feet depending on the angle of collision, the motion of the sea and the relative momentum of the ships. A man in full bronze armour crossing that gap in the middle of a sea battle, with enemy archers shooting at him and his ship potentially already beginning to sink beneath his feet, was performing a feat of controlled desperation. Persian marines carried longer-reach weapons, bows and javelins, that allowed them to inflict casualties from a distance before contact. Greek hoplites, with their heavier shields and thrusting spears, were at a disadvantage in a ranged exchange but devastatingly effective the moment they could close to arm's length. The fighting on the decks of engaged ships during the third day of Artemisium was, by the physical evidence of what we know about these weapons and these men, as savage and close as anything that happened at any battle of the ancient world. By midday of the third day, with the battle still raging across the strait, the Greek fleet was in serious trouble. Half of the Athenian ships, the largest single contingent in the entire Allied fleet, had suffered damage ranging from repairable to catastrophic. The Oxford Classical Dictionary's account of the battle, drawing on Herodotus Book 8, records that by the afternoon of the third day the Greeks had so many ships damaged that they were already seriously considering withdrawal even before any outside news arrived. The oarsmen, who had now fought 2 days of battle and rowed countless sorties during the 3-day engagement, were exhausted beyond what one more day of this attrition could sustain. The marines had taken casualties that could not be replaced on the water. Ships with broken rams were useless as ramming platforms and could only fight as floating infantry positions. The Greek fleet was not broken. They had not been routed, they had not fled, they had not collapsed under the Persian assault. But they had been ground down, ship by ship and man by man, to a point where the question of whether to continue was no longer a matter of will, but of arithmetic. And then, in the middle of this grinding, exhausting, world-historic struggle, a small boat came through the Euripus Channel from the south. It carried a single messenger. His name was Abronichus, son of Lysicles, an Athenian who had been stationed at Thermopylae specifically to carry news between the land army and the fleet, a communication link that Herodotus tells us had been deliberately established at the beginning of the campaign, because Themistocles and Leonidas both understood that what happened at the pass and what happened on the water were inseparable. Abronichus had rowed hard to reach Artemisium. He came aboard the flagship, and he delivered the news that changed everything. Leonidas was dead. The pass at Thermopylae had fallen. The Persian army was pouring through. The exact sequence of what followed in those first minutes after the messenger arrived is not recorded in the sources with the kind of moment-by-moment detail that the drama deserves. What Herodotus tells us is that the Greek commanders received the news and that the decision to withdraw was made quickly. Indeed, it was probably the fastest decision of the entire campaign, because there was nothing to decide. With Thermopylae gone, the strategic logic of holding Artemisium dissolved instantly. The Greek fleet's entire purpose at this position had been to hold the northern sea passage in coordination with the land defence of the pass. Thermopylae was the lock, Artemisium was the key. With the lock broken, the key was useless where it stood. If the fleet remained at Artemisium now, it would find itself fighting an advancing Persian navy with no friendly territory behind it, no port for resupply, and the Persian land army marching south through central Greece toward Athens and the Peloponnese. The fleet had to move, and it had to move immediately, before the Persian navy could reorganize from the third day's fighting and press a renewed attack on a fleet already half crippled by attrition. As the Greek ships disengaged from the battle and turned their damaged bows southward, Themistocles took one final political action that would prove, in retrospect, to be among the most consequential acts of the entire war. He ordered messages carved into the rocks at every fresh water spring along the Euboean coast, messages addressed to the Ionian Greeks who were rowing in the Persian fleet. The inscriptions, as Herodotus records them, were simple and direct. The Ionian Greeks who served under Persian command should desert to the Greek side, or at least fight badly and sabotage the Persian effort. Whether any of them heeded this call at Artemisium is unclear. Whether they remembered it when the fleets met again at Salamis is a question history leaves tantalizingly open, but the act itself was vintage Themistocles. Even in retreat, even with the fleet half destroyed and the news of Thermopylae still echoing in every man's chest, he was already thinking 4 moves ahead. Artemisium was behind them, Athens lay ahead. And somewhere in the narrows of the island of Salamis, the final battle for Greece was waiting. The messenger Abronichus had not rowed through the Euripus Channel with a rumour or an unconfirmed report from a scared lookout on a distant ridge. He had rowed with certainty. Leonidas was dead. The pass at Thermopylae was open. The Persian army, a force modern scholars estimate at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 men, was already pouring south through the mountains of central Greece, unopposed and unimpeded toward the heart of the Greek world. The news hit the Greek fleet at Artemisium not like a defeat, but like the sudden collapse of the ground beneath their feet. Every man on every ship understood in that moment the full meaning of what had happened. The strategy that had held this fleet at Artemisium for 3 days of brutal fighting, the coordinated defence of both the land pass and the sea lane, had been premised on both positions holding long enough for the Persian advance to stall or bleed itself into a negotiated withdrawal. That premise was now gone. Thermopylae was behind them. The sea lane they had died to defend was strategically worthless the moment the land route it was meant to complement fell open. The Greek fleet at Artemisium was not defeated. It was simply, instantly and completely, without a strategic reason to exist where it stood. The decision to withdraw was made in the manner that all the most important decisions of the Artemisium campaign had been made, in the compressed, urgent atmosphere of commanders who knew that every minute of deliberation was a minute the Persian fleet could use to reorganize and pursue. Euboea, the Spartan commander who held nominal overall command of the Allied fleet, gave the order. The Greeks would withdraw south. The route lay down through the Euripus Channel, the narrow passage between the island of Euboea and the mainland of Boeotia, and then southwest around the southern tip of Euboea into the Saronic Gulf, and toward the island of Salamis, which lay just offshore from the Athenian port of Piraeus. The wounded ships, and there were many, would need to move carefully. The oarsmen, who had already rowed through 2 days of fighting, plus the brutal grind of the third, would need to summon whatever reserves of endurance remained in their bodies. There was no time for rest, no time for the ritual mourning of the dead that Greek custom demanded. The fleet had to move. Before the fleet pushed off from the beaches of Artemisium for the last time, Themistocles carried out the action that Herodotus records with a mixture of admiration and bemusement. The carved rock inscriptions addressed to the Ionian Greeks fighting in the Persian fleet. At every fresh water spring along the Euboean coast, where Greek ships might stop to fill their water jars, he ordered messages cut into the stone. The content, as Herodotus preserves it, was simultaneously a political appeal, a military invitation, and a piece of calculated psychological warfare. The inscriptions asked the Ionian Greeks, those men who shared language, ancestry, religion, and culture with the mainland Greeks they were fighting, to abandon Xerxes and come over to the Greek side. If they could not do that, then they should at least fight badly, sabotage Persian operations from within, and remember whose blood they actually shared. Whether any of them acted on these messages at Artemisium we do not know with certainty. What Herodotus does tell us, with a characteristic mixture of reporting and commentary, is that Themistocles intended the messages to serve two purposes simultaneously. If the Ionian Greeks read them and defected, it would strengthen the Greek fleet. If the Persian commanders read them, as they inevitably would, it would introduce a layer of suspicion and distrust into the Ionian contingents of the Persian navy that could only help the Greek cause. It was, in every sense, a message designed to win regardless of how it was received. The withdrawal itself was a controlled, disciplined operation that speaks to the quality of command the Greek fleet had developed over 3 days of intense fighting. A fleet in retreat after battle is at its most vulnerable. Ships are damaged, crews are exhausted, formation discipline degrades under the combined pressure of fatigue and the fear of pursuit. The Persian fleet, having fought hard through the 3rd day and then watched the Greek ships turn south, had every incentive to press immediately into pursuit and finish the job. That they did not catch and destroy the retreating Greek fleet in the Euripus Channel is a testament partly to the Greek speed and discipline in withdrawing, and partly to the Persian fleet's own exhaustion and disorganization after 3 days of punishing combat and 2 catastrophic storms. The Greeks moved south through the narrowing channel between Euboea and the Boeotian coast, the same waters that the 53 Athenian ships had been guarding against the now destroyed Persian flanking fleet, and emerged into the Saronic Gulf with their formation largely intact. Damaged ships were helped by healthier ones. Crews that had pushed past the boundaries of endurance rode on pure instinct and collective will. The fleet that turned south from Artemisium was battered, depleted, and bone-tired, but it was still a fleet. It had not been routed, it had not been annihilated, and that fact, that this collection of city-state ships had absorbed the full fury of the Persian navy for 3 days in a narrow strait, and come out the other side still capable of organised movement would matter enormously in the weeks that followed. As the Greek fleet made its way south towards Salamis, the human dimension of what was about to unfold for Athens specifically deserves to be understood fully, because it transforms the retreat from Artemisium from a military manoeuvre into something far more devastating on a human level. Athens, the city that had built the fleet, that had provided more than half the ships at Artemisium, that had staked its entire national identity on the gamble of naval power over the past decade, Athens was going to have to be abandoned. The Athenian assembly, almost certainly acting on plans that Themistocles had outlined before the campaign even began, had already voted to evacuate the city. The decree, preserved in its most famous form in a stone inscription found at Troezen, though historians debate its precise authenticity, called for the city's women, children and elderly to be transported to the city of Troezen on the Peloponnesian coast, where the people of Troezen had generously offered to shelter them. The movable property of wealthy families was to be sent to Salamis for safekeeping. The treasurers and priestesses of the goddess Athena were to remain on the Acropolis, maintaining the sacred flame and guarding the divine patrimony of the city. Every able-bodied man of Athens was to board a trireme and fight. The evacuation of Athens was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary acts of collective sacrifice in the ancient world. A city of roughly 30,000 to 40,000 free citizens, plus many more slaves, resident foreigners, and dependents, was organised to pick up everything it could carry and walk away from homes, farms, temples, the graves of its ancestors, and the physical fabric of everything that made Athens Athens. Herodotus records that the evacuation was not orderly in the way that a military withdrawal is orderly. It was chaotic, heartbreaking, and at moments grotesque. Families loaded their household goods onto boats and carts. Elderly men who could not be moved were left behind on the Acropolis, having convinced themselves that the oracle's reference to a wooden wall meant the old wooden palisade surrounding the sacred hill, rather than the wooden hulls of the fleet. Dogs reportedly followed their masters to the shoreline and swam after the departing boats. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, preserves the detail that a dog belonging to Xanthippus, the father of the future statesman Pericles, swam alongside the trireme that was carrying his master all the way across to Salamis, and then died of exhaustion on the beach. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it tells us. The evacuation of Athens was not a strategic abstraction. It was the abandonment of an entire civilization's physical home, and every person who walked away from that city knew they might never see it again. They were right to fear it. The Persian army, moving south through central Greece after the fall of Thermopylae, reached Athens within days of the Greek fleet's withdrawal from Artemisium. The Acropolis, defended by the handful of Athenians who had barricaded themselves behind wooden barriers at the approach to the sacred hill, resisted for a time. But the Persians found a way up the cliff face from the north, through a path the defenders had left unguarded because they believed it impassable. The defenders were killed. The temples on the Acropolis, including the old temple of Athena that stood on the site where the Parthenon would later be built, were looted and then burned. Xerxes, standing in his captured capital, looked out over the Saronic Gulf to where the island of Salamis lay visible on the horizon, and saw the Greek fleet anchored in the strait between the island and the mainland. He had taken Athens. He had burned its temples. He had driven its people from their homes, and yet the Greek fleet was still there, intact, waiting, and blocking the final sea road to the Peloponnese and the destruction of the last Greek resistance. The war was not over. It had simply moved to a new and final arena. The strategic significance of what had been accomplished at Artemisium only becomes fully clear in this context, with Athens burning on the hill and the two fleets separated by the narrow strip of water at Salamis. Artemisium had not been a victory in the conventional sense. The Greeks had withdrawn, and the Persians still controlled the northern Aegean. But the battle had accomplished something that no amount of Persian gold or political pressure had been able to achieve. It had proven, beyond any tactical doubt, that the Greek fleet could engage the Persian navy in confined waters and hold its own. It had proven the strategic concept that Themistocles had staked his entire career on, that in a narrow strait, numbers meant less than skill and training and the courage of men fighting for their own survival. Every Greek commander who had been at Artemisium carried that knowledge with them to Salamis. They had seen the Kyklos work. They had seen what happened to Persian ships when they were forced to fight in a constrained space against well-handled Greek triremes. They had seen that the storms of the Aegean could be a weapon in itself, stripping the Persian fleet of its numerical advantage in ways that no human agency could replicate. And Themistocles, who had orchestrated the entire Artemisium campaign through a combination of bribery, strategic brilliance, and sheer force of will, had also learned something equally important. He had learned his own fleet. He had seen what his captains could do under pressure, what the Athenian oarsmen were capable of, how the allied coalition held together and where it showed strain. At Salamis, he would use all of that knowledge with devastating precision. The decision by the Persian command to engage the Greek fleet in the narrow strait at Salamis, rather than simply bypassing it, blockading it, and letting hunger and political disintegration do the work, a decision that would prove catastrophic for Persia, grew directly from the confidence born at Artemisium. The Persian naval commanders had watched the Greek fleet withdraw from Artemisium and interpreted it as weakness, as evidence that 3 days of sustained pressure could force the Greeks to break. They were wrong. What they had seen was not a broken fleet retreating in despair. They had seen a fleet that had absorbed 3 days of everything Persia could throw at it, made a rational strategic decision based on changed circumstances on land, and withdrawn in good order to fight a battle of its own, choosing on ground of its own selection. The distinction between a fleet that runs because it is beaten and a fleet that withdraws because it is thinking was one that the Persian command failed to appreciate. It would cost them everything. In late September 480 BC, a date ancient sources place around the 29th, in the narrow waters between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast, the Greek fleet would destroy roughly a third of what remained of the Persian navy in a single day of fighting. Xerxes would watch the battle from a golden throne set up on a hill overlooking the strait. He would see his fleet crumble in the confined waters exactly as it had struggled at Artemisium, and he would understand too late that the battle he was losing on the water had already been decided 3 weeks earlier in the 3 days of fire and wood at Artemisium. The men who died at Artemisium, whose names are largely lost to us, ground into the anonymity of mass historical suffering, died in waters that history has never fully honoured. They do not have the monument at Thermopylae with its inscription about the Spartans obeying the law. They do not have the triumphant narrative of Salamis with its decisive victory and the watching emperor. They have only the cold Aegean water where they fought and the record Herodotus left of what they did there. But without what they did there, neither Thermopylae's legend nor Salamis' triumph would have been possible. They bought the time that Salamis needed. They proved the concept that Salamis required. They held the line on water for 3 days, when holding the line was the only thing that stood between Greek civilization and its extinction. That, in the final accounting of history, is not a hollow retreat. It is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. What happened at Artemisium in August of 480 BC was not a victory, and it was not a defeat. It was something rarer and in many ways more important than either. It was proof of concept, the brutal blood-soaked demonstration that an outnumbered fleet of free men, fighting in the right place with the right tactics, and a leader willing to make the hard decisions that no one else would make, could hold the most powerful navy on earth to a grinding, costly standstill. Every lesson learned in those 3 days of fire and wood, the close, the value of narrow water, the importance of crew training, the psychological weight of fighting for something real rather than fighting under compulsion, was carried south to Salamis and deployed again with refinements that turned stalemate into decisive, civilization-saving victory. Artemisium is called a minor engagement in the footnotes of history textbooks that spend 40 pages on Thermopylae and 20 more on Salamis. But there is nothing minor about roughly 300 Greek warships holding off the largest naval armada the ancient world ever assembled for 3 consecutive days. There is nothing minor about 30,000 Athenian civilians walking away from their homes in the knowledge that their city would be burned, because they trusted that the fleet their fathers had built and their sons were now rowing would eventually bring them back. There is nothing minor about Themistocles, the half-citizen son of a minor family who had spent his entire career being dismissed by people with better bloodlines and more powerful friends, turning out to be the single most important strategic mind in the entire war. The man who saw the whole picture when everyone around him could only see the part directly in front of them. History remembers the 300. It should also remember the 54,000, the oarsmen, the marines, the pilots, and the captains who rowed into the straits of Artemisium knowing what was waiting for them, and rowed out the other side 3 days later still able to fight. The pass at Thermopylae could not have been held without the fleet holding the water beside it. The victory at Salamis could not have been won without the experience forged at Artemisium. The freedom of Greece, and with it, by the long logic of historical consequence, the preservation of the democratic and philosophical tradition that would eventually shape the entire Western world, passed through this water before it passed through any other. Artemisium was not the other Thermopylae. In the water, it was Thermopylae itself. If this story hit the way it was meant to, the join button is right below this video. Wars in History members get early access to every video before it goes public, behind-the-scenes research breakdowns, and the knowledge that they are directly funding history told without compromise, no algorithm deciding what gets softened, no sponsor deciding what gets cut, just the brutal truth every time. Click join, become a member, and we will see you in the next battle.